have our agenda up. Okay, well, welcome to our viewing audience and to our trap check interval work group members. We are, if you're wanting to watch the trap check work group, then you're in the right place. We are going from 2 to 4 today, and we've got our full trap check committee here. Sam, you want to go ahead and go to the next slide? Zoom meeting tips. Everybody has old hand at Zoom meeting. I won't go through all the details. I would remind everybody that if we can stay on video, that would be helpful. And if you're an alternate, which if you're an alternate and not working as a primary today, then again, the rules for alternates are you can stay in the meeting and listen, but we ask that you keep yourself on mute. So go ahead and go to the next slide. And again, just a reminder of where you can find your controls. And if you can't find your raise hand, or if it doesn't appear, because on some people's interface with an iPad in particular, the raise hand is either in an odd spot or not there. So you can always just raise your hand. Okay, I think that brings us to what's our next one? Agenda or ground rules? Agenda. So if you recall from our last meeting together, we had discussed that it would be really helpful to take a deeper dive in the trap check comparisons across states. And so we worked with a little subgroup of all of you to help figure out, kind of what the questions are that we wanted to bring forward to the group and the level of detail. And there were some very specific questions asked, particularly of Kevin from APHIS. So we have Kevin and Derek today, and I think Derek's actually going to go first. Kevin got on a little bit early, and we were chatting with him, and Derek has a spreadsheet that he wants to share, which I think sets the stage for Kevin's presentation. And Sam, did we send out that Excel spreadsheet from Derek to everybody?
Yes, we did.
And we did, and that's also on the posted on the ODFW website, right?
Yep.
Yep. Okay. So for everybody viewing, that if you go to the ODFW website, you can find the information that Derek will be presenting today. Kevin has some PowerPoint slides, and we'll post those after the meeting, and they'll be included with the meeting summary. So our focus today is this conversation around trap check comparisons across states. So that's our focus. And then I do have two pieces that I've got bookended here on the meeting. The first one you see from 2 to 2:15 is what we're doing now. An overview of the work plan and the process. I've got a little chart I'm going to introduce to you. And then at the end of our conversation with Kevin and Derek, I'm going to put it back up on the screen for us to have a little bit more conversation about it. So if any questions about the agenda? Okay, seeing none. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide, which I think is our ground rules. Same ground rules we've been using all along. You can take a moment to refresh your memory about what those are. And we'll go ahead and go to the next slide. So this is the one I wanted to introduce to all of you. We did a similar slide for our Beaver work group that we'll be sharing tomorrow. And so there's a couple of things I wanted to draw your attention to. And I didn't want to get deep in the weeds on this before the presentations, but I wanted to introduce it so that you had a sense of where we are and where we're going. And so you'll see on the left side, you've got all the topics of the meetings that we've had to date. And then across the top are our meeting dates. And you'll notice that we have meeting dates on the calendar through into December, but nothing past that. And so when we were working backwards from a potential ODFW presentation about potential recommendations from this group, it occurred to us that those materials need to get to ODFW Commission fairly far in advance. And so as we were mapping that out and looking at what we thought the group might need in terms of time to actually talk through and work up the recommendations, what we realized is we are going to need 2 meetings in January of this group, And then we can have a back pocket meeting potentially in February, but we pretty much should be done by the end of January, so that whatever materials we want to get to the commission, they need to get those materials in early February for a March presentation. And so we gave a heads up to the commissioners and staff, kind of ground truth this to make sure that that timing made sense. But we realized we hadn't talked about it with all of you. So we have talked with commission and staff here just in the last couple of weeks about kind of what needs to happen moving forward. And so we wanted to introduce that to all of you, that Sam's going to be reaching out to schedule those 2 meetings in January and the one in February, and that we're really looking at a March commission meeting for presenting recommendations, and materials would be put forward in February. So, and then you'll see down on the left side, if you look under, so where we are today, here we are on the 26th with the state trap check program comparison. Another item that has been teed up that people said they were interested to hear more about is more specifics around injuries and trauma to wildlife, a discussion with veterinarian experts. And so we've potentially teed that up for a meeting in November, but we can talk about that at the end of our conversation with Derek and Kevin about upcoming meeting topics. And so I'd like you all to be thinking about other informational pieces that you want us to bring forward, but do recognize that I think it would be really helpful for us to have, at least 2 or 3 meetings where we're really talking about recommendations and weighing pros and cons and looking at some drafts that are in writing, for us to refine. And so, as you're listening to Derek and Kevin today, be thinking about any other informational topics that you think would be really helpful in terms of developing recommendations. One that Commissioner Woolley has brought up to us is the economic side, and he's mentioned that in the past. And so we need to figure out where that goes, and we have a couple of ideas around that as well. So I think, so I want to save our discussion about this until after Derek and Kevin's presentation, but I just wanted to introduce this so you can be thinking about it when we revisit it at 3:30. So with that, if we want to go ahead and go to Kevin and Derek, and Derek, I believe we're starting with you.
All right.
And hi, Jill. Welcome.
Share my screen. Okay.
Oh, actually, Derek,
Yeah.
you just said I'm going to take that spot. How would you like people to engage with you? Do you want them to ask questions throughout? Do you want you and Kevin to get through your stuff and then ask questions? What do you think?
I'll speak for Kevin. I think I'd like to go with the latter to try to keep us on time and create more opportunity for the dialogue. Maybe he and I can run through our sections and then just let it be for a free for all. Because I'll speak for myself. I think I'm just kind of supplying some of the thought nuggets and let the group chew on it. And then I can answer questions as need be, but I don't think I'm going to be dumping a lot of content on folks right away.
Okay. So we will plan on having everyone ask their questions at the end of both your presentations. All right, take it away, Derek.
Okay, thank you, Jamie. Yeah, so I could just kind of gave away my secret, which is I'm hoping to just bring the whole group up to speed on a few topics, try to get us to a place where we can have a common understanding of other state regulations and where those come from, how they're devised, how they got implemented and what they kind of mean and what they reflect. And so as Jamie mentioned, we went through an effort to try to identify what states to use as examples to compare with. And I'll go in a little bit of detail of how we came up with our list. I think we still only whittled it down to like 20. So at least we cut it by half. But we all recognize that by trying to genuinely compare Oregon against the entire country, it's just too much to bite off. So I'm going to just touch on the recreational licensed trapper activities and trap checks around states. And then Kevin is going to touch on regulations specific to wildlife damage and then regulations specific to wildlife services. So hopefully I can set the stage for him pretty well as I move forward. To talk about what's going on in other states, I just wanted to take a few moments to remind us of where we came from in Oregon and where we're at in Oregon. This is content that I've presented earlier in this work group process, but ultimately, at one point we had 48-hour trap checks for fur bearers and unprotected mammals, and we had no trap check times for predatory animals. An Oregon bill established a 48-hour or a trap check not to exceed 48 hours for fur bearers. And the legislature specifically separated what predatory animals and said that those trap check intervals should occur on a regular basis. And so the commission then went and took on the responsibility to define what on a regular basis meant. And so there was a work group process. And ultimately, the commission adopted regulations that we have in place today, which are 76 hours for live traps, 7 days for live traps when damage is occurring, and 30 days for kill traps. And again, that's just for predatory animals. When it comes to fur bearers and unprotected mammals, it's still the 48. So regarding the factors that go into these regulations, it reflects the public activities, the motivations, values, concerns, and the physical environment. And these regulations really are not all that specific, or these concepts are not specific to wildlife management, or especially trapping regulations. There are all sorts of hunting regulations that you can see differ across the states, and oftentimes for very similar reasons. Anybody that spent any time in other states can tell about all sorts of odd or interesting other regulations, such as speed limits or toll roads. There's all sorts of policy put in place around the country that oftentimes are based on some underlying principles. And a lot of times those regulations are in place to reflect what's currently going on in those areas. And I think many of us can probably provide examples of how those differ, myself included. But for today, we wanted to try to be consistent and specific in how we try to compare these states, or what states, or how to identify which states to compare to. There are a number of things that we could look at, even things like the number of trappers out on the landscape, the specific trap types that are most commonly used, certain exemptions, certain needs for safety, or other type of data. But really, we want to try to look at these factors that we could quantify to really try and show why one state got included versus excluded. And a lot of this still goes back to touching on the major reasons why these regulations get in place, or what they are, where they are. And so again, this is all in the content that was well discussed in previous meetings in this work group, but also in the commission meetings regarding setting of those regulations. But today we're going to focus on the target species in a particular state, road density, human density, and also wildlife values. So for target species, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies sends out a survey about every 5 years to trappers around the country to obtain an enormous amount of information. And one of them is the target species, or the species that most trappers are pursuing, or they desire to harvest. And nationally, there's a pretty consistent trend that in states with species that have smaller home ranges, such as raccoons that you find in the Midwest, that's the number one target species for a lot of the Midwest, you start to see smaller trap check intervals versus states that are pursuing species like bobcats and coyotes that have much larger home ranges. You oftentimes see those being associated with states with larger trap check intervals. And I do want to point out that these graphs, we're using data from a couple different resources I could send out, including the OFA data, as I mentioned, but I did truncate some of the trap check times to 100 for graphing purposes, even though we have states that don't have a trap check time, such as Montana. So just looking at the OFA data of states that have bobcats as the top focal species, which is indeed the case in Oregon, you see that there are a handful of states that also have bobcats as their target species, most of them occurring out here in Western Oregon, or sorry, Western United States. And I'm not going to go into the regulations state by state by state, because we can do that later if need be. But nonetheless, this is just us trying to show you what, other states are out there comparable to Oregon on these particular topics. But I will point out Colorado here. Colorado is a state where their trapping regulations primarily, or trap check times, are dictated by ballot initiative. And so cage traps are the only trap that can be used. And they have a daily trap check. However, in areas of the state where they are interested or focused on links reestablishment or reintroductions, they actually have a 24-hour trap check in place to try to reduce unnecessary bycatch, or at least if links are caught in a trap, people are likely to be there sooner than if they had a daily trap check. The other factor that we looked at is road density. And similarly, as you start to see higher and higher road densities, you see shorter and shorter trap check periods, and the inverse is true as well. And so looking at what states to compare for this topic, we simply just looked at what Oregon's values were and included the states that had road densities that were basically the closest 5 lower and 5 higher. So we had 11 states here, including Oregon, to look at those differences. And so, that's another way we can compare things from Oregon and these other states. Not necessarily road density specific, probably a little bit more human density related, but I will just point out Maine while it's up here, that Maine has a daily trap check time for live traps. But when they have traps that are set underneath ice, things start to get highly variable. They have a 24-hour trap check if these sets are set inside town limits or city limits. It's 3 days outside of townships, and it's 5 days in unincorporated areas. And again, the political boundaries are a little bit complex in New England. Towns don't necessarily make sense. Townships are a different thing. And then counties oftentimes almost have no identity or value. So again, that's, the Maine situation reflects the circumstances in Maine, but also Maine has some interest in also trying to avoid links. So they have other regulations that are specific to their state because of trying to avoid links, kind of like Colorado, but that obviously does not apply in a lot of places in the country. And so looking at road density and why this is, a pretty important factor or a factor in decision-making is very simply, where you go out in the country, you see very different densities of roads, the structure of roads, the speeds of roads, and that can have an enormous impact on accessibility. And in some places of the country, road ditches or areas just off of road ditches are highly desirable for setting traps. So here's an image of Connecticut. Here's an image of Iowa. Both at the same scale. You can see there's cities and roads all over the place, residential areas all over the place in Connecticut. Iowa, not nearly as many urban centers, but goodness, there's a maintained road nearly every single mile, every direction, which means that you can get anywhere really, really fast. Versus looking at Oregon, quite a bit different in certain places in Oregon. This is an area zoomed in southeastern Oregon. Highly desirable bobcats get harvested in this part of the state. You can see very few roads, not much for urban centers. So just so different when trying to speak about things at large scales. But that's why road density definitely plays a major role in the regulations for trapping and other wildlife specific activities. And similar to the roads is human density. We see as human density goes up, we start to see shorter trap check times. And again, that's for probably some pretty important reasons, which is to try to reduce negative encounters with public, negative encounters with pets. You just have a lot more people around. So it's just kind of a numbers game where you've got more at risk, or you have higher odds of an unfavorable circumstance. So the regulations reflect that. And again, you're starting to see some of these states pop up on a number of these lists for Oregon. Again, Maine came up on there again. But it is kind of interesting, again, or not that big of a surprise that when we're talking about road density and human density, we're still seeing a lot of similarities across Western states. although again, Maine being kind of the oddball, literally clear on the other side of the country. And not included in the human density, though, is trapper numbers. We didn't dive into that for this presentation to help with the discussion, but when you've got a lot of trappers in a small area, that does oftentimes increase the need for more regulations or to have shorter trap check intervals because you just have more people out there. And so it's kind of interesting, as big as the Western United States is, we have, in one estimate, the same number of trappers as just New England itself. Whereas the Midwest has 5 times as many trappers as all of the West. So these types of things definitely factor into those regulations and how they exist today. And so then another topic that actually Kelly brought up that she wanted to see if we could try to tease out, we're trying to compare wildlife values across states. And so using a recent report from work being done at Colorado State University, they were able to quantify the proportion of these clades or bins of the public and how they view wildlife. And I included the exact definitions on here because I didn't want to do them a disservice, because these are pretty meaty definitions and descriptions. And so I don't want to make it appear at all that I'm any sort of expert on how to define these groupings, but that's how the data was split out, with the traditionalists in general viewing wildlife as essentially useful for the benefit of the public. Excuse me. Mutualists viewing wildlife as kind of one of their own, they view it as a part of their extended social network. Pluralists are a little bit of both, depending on the situation. And those that are distant exhibit very low interest in wildlife at all, one way or the other. They're just very distant from the topic. So following Kelly's recommendation, we were able to pull out those values for states and try to look at trap checks. And across the country, the relationships aren't nearly as well-fitting, but nonetheless, you can see a bit of a trend as you have more traditionalists in a state, you start to see larger trap check intervals, versus if you have more mutualists, you start to see shorter trap check intervals. And so when looking at what states to compare to Oregon, we basically looked at those numbers, and if a value on any one of those columns was within 10% of the Oregon values, we flagged those. But certainly there's a couple different ways we could try to include or exclude certain states. But this table here just shows those states that have had some of those columns match Oregon's values. And you can see Arizona, Texas, and Washington kind of have really good match with Oregon across all 4 of those different classes, versus some states like Kansas really only has a match under the traditionalist values. Otherwise, they're outside of that 10% value. So that's kind of just my quick and dirty presentation over where we came up with those numbers and how this table will hopefully be used to help further this discussion. But before I hand it off to Kevin, I just wanted to point out that there's some consistent kind of messages or things when looking at the other states. We oftentimes see that the trap check regulations will vary based on the types of trap sets, whether they're a kill set or a live set. We see those numbers differ. Some states will also make exceptions for trap types, or if they only have or they only allow cage traps, that very much dictates what they're going to do with their regulations. You can also see some pretty consistent differences regionally. And again, a lot of these aren't all that out of the ordinary when we talk about other regulations that, say, a Fish and Wildlife Agency is very familiar with. Things like weapons restrictions or other types of activities. A lot of those are very much dictated on those exact same things, such as the terrain, human density, road density, and then also very specifically the species that you're pursuing. elk and deer or elk and moose regulations are oftentimes going to be quite a bit different than just white-tailed deer regulations. And so you see that that's why those things differ so enormously from state to state based on what are the species available and what are the target species. So kind of like the beaver work group, there's tons of surrogates and tons of examples in wildlife management beyond just the focal topic that we can happily tap into to try to talk about some consistencies across the landscape. So that's end of my section, and I am happy to punt it over to Kevin so he can continue. Oh, I don't want to share. I want to share.
Thanks, Derek. And I hope folks have been taking notes of questions that you'd like to ask when Kevin's done. I know I've got a few that I've captured. All right, Kevin, we're seeing your screen just fine.
Okay, thank you. And I am unmuted, right?
You're unmuted, yeah. Your sharing is not in presentation mode though, just FYI.
It's a PDF.
Oh, okay.
I just convert it to a PDF. It's easier to share that way. So just kind of a recap from what I presented about a month ago was, and the reason I'm taking the approach, it's going to be a little bit text heavy, but that's under an intention of providing this to the working group members. And so they have more information to refer back to. So I hope to have a little bit more of a free flow in the dialogue than just relying upon the text that's going to be on the slides. But in looking at Wildlife Services, the question for is what Wildlife Services does here in Oregon, and also then in comparison to other states. I just wanted to provide a little bit more of the framework for Wildlife Services and the decision process that goes into conducting wildlife damage management. Our vision is to improve coexistence. And our mission is to help provide that leadership and a response to help individuals with wildlife conflicts. Pertaining to this subject, as mentioned before, when we look at BMPs, there's some key points that I just want to draw upon with best management practices, is that although there's a host of options that were used in comparison, and they were looked at from a variety of matrix in those standards. But the key point was looking at and realizing that there's always going to be a trade-off based upon considering animal welfare, the efficiency or the selectivity, the practicality. There's a lot of things that are going to be driven by on-site application. And that was readily recognized by the BMP development. Also that because of the varied terms that have been used in this working group, I just wanted to key in on the statement with the White et al. Paper with the BMPs made about animal welfare. We often refer to humaneness as kind of a broad category, but that they acknowledge that it's a complex issue and that there's lots of aspects to it. But that given the requirements of the ISO, the International Organization of Standardization that they followed for the trap BMP development, that they looked at identifying animal injury as kind of the key component of that animal humaneness and welfare. And that even they recognize that there is a big discussion related to animal humaneness and animal welfare, and that there's going to continue to be a lot of different perspectives based upon that subject. Wildlife Services, we have directives, often referred to as policies, that help to direct our activities and how we're going to implement those. And a couple key ones that come to mind is the integrated wildlife damage management approach that we take, looking at all alternatives, and in specific, and looking at when you have a damage circumstance, looking at that frequency, the extent of the magnitude of that damage, but also then looking at what those potential effects are to targets, non-targets, what the environmental conditions are, relative costs, techniques, environmental impacts, and so forth. That there's a lot that goes into those considerations before we actually begin implementing any type of non-lethal or lethal control or management.
Here's what I found.
Remove that from my wrist. I don't need my wrist talking to me. And also that trapping devices in those BMPs, that they recognize that there's going to be times that they may not be adequate to apply. In the development of BMPs, they looked at traps efficiency in capturing target animals at a 60% level. Whereas when we're trying to address conflicts, we want to increase the likelihood that we're going to be capturing the animal that is causing the damage. So in the consideration of trying to understand implementing wildlife damage management, you're looking at some of the recognized needs. And Derek kind of articulated to this earlier in describing what has already been provided to this working group and also what was shared in prior meetings, prior sessions in other years, was that the current rules have gone through an extensive process to be able to look at and addressing what the needs were and recognizing that the needs to address damage are well organized and dictated in our rules. Interesting to note that we're going to show on the chart that you've were sent earlier was looking at other states. Likewise, many of the other states recognize the need to address damage in wildlife conflicts by allowing additional tools, methods, or timing and the use of those methods to be able to address conflicts and damage. Looking at agriculture as at large, interesting statistic and the numbers, but essentially, agriculture makes up a huge percentage of our Oregon economy. And that's not part of today's topic, but just kind of presenting part of that discussion piece when we look at why is it so important to be able to understand the impact of damage and making decisions leading to damage management. And on the last part of this, just recognizing that areas and aspects of wildlife management, just like Derek showed on the map, you've got urban densities as well as to very sparsely populated rural locations where damage occurs. And the need to be equitable in providing services to people throughout all aspects of those communities. And so when you're looking at road densities, as he articulated and described, that's a key characteristics of things that we have to take in consideration for our ability to be able to provide and respond to damage. Another aspect that we've talked about, but I think is a very important subject in understanding why there may be a need to have a difference in addressing conflicts and damage, is that we're not only looking at the humaneness of the animals that are being trapped, whether the target species or those potential non-targets, but we're also focusing on the humaneness of those animals that we're protecting, and whether those are livestock, whether they're pets, or even in some circumstances that might be people. Looking at over the generations, most of those defensive behaviors have been bred out of livestock to make them more handling friendly so that they can interact with them, they can vaccinate them, they can move them. And as such, those resource owners, those livestock owners or pet owners have a huge responsibility as well as a moral sense in their ethics to protect those animals. So part of the calculated decision in addressing a conflict is there is a need to understand and observe the welfare of the animals that are being trapped, but there is a trade-off to look at. What is the welfare of the animals that are being protected and what could happen to them or continue to happen if an action isn't taken, or if the solution isn't rendered quickly enough. And if we can't capture that animal that's causing the damage, how much more of that animal suffering and animal injury could occur. So minimizing the amount of time that an animal is in a trap is key for helping to create humaneness or animal welfare for that trapped animal, but it's also key for promoting efficiency in that management action. The sooner that we can capture the target animal, the sooner that we can move on to a different and address a different conflict or a different problem elsewhere. And so it's advantageous to be able to work that as quickly as possible. But at the same time, the effectiveness of trapping can also be impacted by our trap checks. So looking at, you can increase the number of trap checks. If the trap is full, that promotes efficiency. But if your trap isn't full, if you don't haven't captured an animal, then you're decreasing that efficiency. But in addition to that, the effectiveness of that trapping tool or method that is applied can go down when you start to visit it more often. In California, there was a ranch or a group of ranch locations where there was like 20 years of data and research that was done on predation on livestock. And I think it had a lot primarily with sheep, but a lot of species. And a lot of good information came from that. One of the anecdotal informations that they found in trying to set up and do some of their observations in their studies was that alpha coyotes, and when we refer to alpha coyotes, we're talking about those breeding adult coyotes that are maintaining a territory, that they actually were hard to catch. And in some cases, they were trying to use camera traps, and they found that all the alpha coyotes that they'd already identified had radio collars avoided their trap sets, their camera traps, through either presence, observing the people actually setting the equipment, or through the other visual or olfactory cues of just that human presence at those sites, and that the alpha coyotes avoided those sites. The young coyotes or other coyotes that might pass through that territory, naive to that area, were the ones that were most vulnerable then to being captured. And they saw a similar correlation in the work that was being conducted to address wildlife conflicts through trapping of animals, that the alpha coyotes have a greater tendency to avoid those, while the other naive coyotes, naive to that area, were easier to catch. And so it really drives to that point that and that study and others associated with it also found that the alpha coyotes were the ones most likely to be causing the damage, the livestock damage. So the ones that are most skilled at avoiding the human presence or the trap sites are the ones most likely to be doing the damage. So if you're increasing a trap check, you're creating a greater challenge for you to be able to actually then capture that animal that is trying to avoid you. Essentially, that has your number, so to say. So looking at that efficiency and effectiveness of trap intervals is really important to try to strike that balance. So getting to the concept that I shared before, not every trap is full when you come back to visit it. Unfortunately, every trapper realizes that they're not going to have an animal in a trap every time they check a trap. And Derek shared the information compiled from the fur bearer harvest about that catch per unit effort being about 1.3 cows per 100. So it gets to that from a wildlife services standpoint, or those that are addressing damage. If you have key animals that are likely to avoid those sets in those locations, if you have a frequent check, you're going to miss that opportunity to be able to capture them. The second part of that is that, again, you will have more often than not when you check traps that animals aren't going to be there. So when you're looking at intervals, even though you might have a maximum interval, it doesn't dictate that you're going to have an animal in that trap for that maximum period of time. So our goal is to obviously to resolve and minimize conflicts and damage. And we most often use a site-specific discretion when we're checking our traps. There's times that are going to dictate when we want to check the trap more frequently because we feel confident that we'll be able to address the conflict quickly. And so it's advantageous for us to get in and check that trap, remove the animal that is causing the damage so that we can then utilize resources elsewhere and address other conflicts. But at the same time, we're looking at opportunities where we're recognizing we have an experienced or trap-wise coyote that we need to let that trap soak long enough, but within the appropriate or authorized check limits, so that we can maximize the opportunity to capture the animal that's causing the damage to be able to abate further conflicts. And just some additional thoughts for wildlife services. You know, when we look at wildlife services, in particular here in Oregon or in other states, is as a federal agency, we're responsible for compliance with ESA. So we're working through consultation process with the federal agencies to work on compliance with endangered species and implementing additional measures that takes into consideration potential effects to those species. And in some cases, following, standard operating procedures or restrictions necessary to promote the conservation and protection of those species. We're also interacting with the other agencies, tribes, and the public through a NEPA process where we're going through extensive review of alternatives, options, potential effects, and incorporating those into our decision making. And so I think through a lot of those aspects, we're trying to demonstrate to the public and to others all the work that goes into making a decision at an individual site. That we try to use the max discretion that we can to address the conflict while incorporating a whole realm of different situations and scenarios that we have to take into account. So I think, Sam, do you want to put up the table? That way I don't have to worry about
Sure.
monkeying with the screen anymore. And Derek already had clips of this that he showed, and the members of this working group were provided a copy of that. So I assume a copy of that will be part of the record. So looking at the states that we were asked to look for comparison, Derek went over the target species, the road densities, and the human densities there on the left side, as well as in the information that correlated to the surveys. We have recreational trapping guides. And so what we see in a lot of the states is, not all of them, but many of the states, that there's a differentiation when it came to damage in the column L, that there's a different set of regulations or guidelines related to the taking of animals causing damage. And then in particular for the column M, which would be specific to wildlife services, in some of those states, there were exemptions, and in many of the states, no exemptions. And then some of those states, they have the same additional allowances that others had to be able to address damage and conflicts. So I think, some of the key takeaways as I was reviewing and looking and talking to some of the other state wildlife services programs is that there's a lot of difference in the program. As I mentioned earlier, but most of our activities are based upon the needs of the state and the individuals that request services from us. There's also a large distinction in how wildlife services is funded in each state based upon who those cooperating agencies and entities are and what priorities they place for the management of conflicts in those states. So even though you look across the board, not every state is comparable because they don't have the same relative comparable program that is in Oregon. Oregon works in a majority of the counties. Livestock, as earlier in the slides, are comprised from every county in the state. And so there is a huge effort in protecting livestock as well as agricultural resources, property resources, and human health and safety. Some of these states, like Derek had mentioned, Colorado, and use that as an example, that's a fairly comparable state from a livestock perspective. They have an area, if you can think of that eastern portion east of the Rocky Mountains, a lot of their state is very conducive for flying. And so they utilize the aerial tool, using an aircraft to be able to shoot coyotes that are preying upon livestock. And so that's a very effective tool for them given the land condition. You look at a state of Maine, they really don't have livestock that they protect from a wildlife services standpoint. The bulk of their work goes to other types of resources, roads and structures, human health and safety, airports. So not knowing, I think I'm going to kind of pause and transition to see what specific questions, the group may have related to what Derek's presented or what I've presented here, or maybe what you've already started to look at and want to know a little bit more about specific states and how comparable they are. I'd just say, Derek, was there anything that you wanted to follow up on now that I've kind of concluded that portion? Okay.
All right. Well, thank you, Devin. I've just turned you into Benifer. Kevin and Derek, appreciate your presentations. Greg, I see your hand up. Others, if you'd like to go ahead and put your hand up to get in the queue. We've got until about 3:30 or so for conversation and discussion. So I've got a good about 50 minutes, 45 minutes. Greg, go ahead.
Okay, and thanks for those presentations, Derek and Kevin. Just a couple questions. I was looking at Utah, and they have longer trap check times for kill traps versus live capture, which to me sounded counterintuitive for reducing animal suffering. So maybe you could help me to understand the reasoning behind that. And then I have another question after that.
Can you scroll, Sam, to the Utah part of the table? We can look at it. There you go.
So, Commissioner Woolley, largely speaking, when we're talking about a killing trap, a trap designed to lethally kill the animal in a very short duration, neck snares are designed, can be designed and used in that method. Conibear traps, or the body gripping traps, are traps that are designed to cause the animal to break its neck quickly and cause that animal to die. So from the standpoint of a trap check, if the trap is designed and effectively euthanizes the animal in a short duration or humanely kills the animal, the check interval, from a damage standpoint, you're not trying to harvest the fur. So the need to get there to be able to harvest the fur is not there. If the animal has been dispatched, then it's just a need to be able to remove the animal and then to finish activities or to follow up with additional activities.
Okay, so the assumption is the animal is killed right away. And if it's not, then it could be in there for days, right? Alive.
That is a potential. I mean, with any trapping, outside of trapping, with anything, there's always going to be outliers as a potential. A lot of risk in what we do throughout our lives. So certainly there is that potential. And I think that from Wildlife Services, I can't speak for others. As I mentioned during the first presentation a month or so ago, from Wildlife Services standpoint for Oregon, our non-target capture rate is about 2% of all our total take. And the lethal portion of that is half. So because we're trying to be so specific and about the individual that we're capturing and the methods that we use, if we're using a method designed to be lethal, we're trying to set that in the way that is going to give us the most confidence that it's going to be used in the manner that it's intended for, so that we don't have animals suffering in the trap. Part of our policies and directive is to try to minimize and avoid that as much as possible.
Right. Okay, so my other question is, with your BMPs, you set a 60% target accuracy. So how is that 60% established? What's that based on?
So in the White et al. Paper, and it actually started a few decades ago when they started doing the BMP development, they looked at the different aspects, and Derek, I'm going to let you chime in and maybe correct any facts or statements, but they looked at the different parameters of what they were wanting to evaluate. One of the items, was the effectiveness of that trap capturing the target species. And so they had to set thresholds for whether it was going to be injury scores or effectiveness or the efficiency. And so to create an umbrella that provided enough options, they established a threshold of a trap having to be at least 60% effective in capturing the target species in order to be on that BMP list. Recognizing that they were trying to look at all the traps, realizing that some traps can be used for multiple species, and at times they're going to be more productive to be used for one species versus another, or in one situation compared to another. And so trying to identify a trap that is BMP compliant, you're trying to recognize the range of which that trap could be applied and utilized. So they set the threshold at 60%. And what I was mentioning in reference to that, if we had a 60% catch rate with a trap, that would not be sufficient, because we're just going to be creating more trap-wise coyotes when those coyotes are already hard to catch the traps. So we don't want to use a trap that has a likely chance of an animal pulling out of it.
So then I shouldn't interpret that as 40% capture of non-target animals is acceptable in the BMPs. I shouldn't look at it that way.
No, correct. That is not the intent of what they were describing with how they evaluated the traps.
Okay. All right, thanks. That's all I have for now.
All right, other folks? Questions, comments, observations? Kyle?
So Kevin, you were saying that your numbers are running about 2% for non-target interaction. Do we have numbers for that? I guess this is a question for Derek, for on the recreational side. Is there any way to quantify that? I had been under the impression Oregon State was working on that at some point, but.
Well, not in like well, I'll say that for our mandatory reporting, we have one field, which is the number of animals released. So that's one way in which we could kind of, as a surrogate, try to say how many times was a non-target captured. However, it's really difficult to tease that out because, as you know, with a bag limit on the number of bobcats that you can harvest in Eastern Oregon, a lot of trappers will release alive smaller bobcats, females, or those that just don't have a good looking coat. So I think it'd be more so if like it was, I don't know, raccoons or things like that that are very low on a priority list. But that's we could try to pull that out. I've never gone to try to see if we could try to calculate a non-target, but it would be pretty difficult because we'd have, again, kind of those caveats of bobcats are frequently being released, but on purpose. And that was the target species. It just wasn't what the animal that they didn't want to harvest. It's kind of like
Right.
well, back in the day talking about, hunters treeing bears and cougars, they could opt not to harvest or try to get a larger one, or hunters, opting not to harvest a buck, although it's legal. They just wanted something else.
Turning back a dark fish instead of a bright one.
Yeah, I don't want to venture into the fish world, but you can certainly make those analogies.
So would it be safe to assume that the recreational and other landowner damage trapping is at least using the same methods as wildlife services is, Kevin?
That is a great question. I'm not going to venture to speak as far as what others using, but when Jim presented here a couple of meetings ago, he talked about his Ready app adaptation to BMP compliant traps really early on. And I think when you look at the trappers, I think we have fewer trappers taking the majority, and I'm talking about the recreational aspect because we have that information. You have fewer trappers that take the majority of the animals being harvested for fur. So you have a smaller subset, and I think you've got some of your very skilled individuals like Jim probably doing the majority of that, and they're really focused intent on improving their capture rate and their holding, so that because that's the productivity for their time. And so I think those individuals that are really focused on that aspect, or like from a wildlife services perspective, focused on really keen in to address conflicts or damage, it's in their interest to minimize non-target catch.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's a fair statement. That middle ground, those in the middle, that trapping is much more of a selective skill set than I would say probably fishing or hunting. I think there's a smaller subset of individuals that really have catered to and developed a skill set for trapping versus someone that might just periodically pick up a track to experiment with it. So I think there's a good likelihood that those are being used, but I can't really speak for that for outside of wildlife services and outside of what Jim articulated a few weeks ago.
So Kyle and Kevin, I see we've got Greg, Jill, and Kelly's hands up. But Jim, I do want to invite you to weigh in because Kevin referenced you several times, and I just am mindful of him speaking, for you. So, is there anything you want to add to answer Kyle's question?
On the side of this, like 60%, catch on these traps. If I've got a trap that I'm only getting a 60% capture rate on, I'm throwing it away. I'm getting rid of it. It's no good. It's causing me more problem than it is anything else. So, you know, I don't know what else to weigh in on it. If there is any other specific questions, I'll try to answer them. But Kevin's done a pretty good job on that.
Yeah, I guess, Jim, to clarify, I was more getting at, can we infer non-target capture rates for the recreational and landowner program from the wildlife services numbers, right? If folks are using the same methods,
You know, I think,
would we expect similar outcomes, right?
yeah, overall, I think that's probably going to be true. You know, right now, you know, I don't know if you live in a rural area, right now you see all kinds of skunks all over the road. They're hit constantly. And I'm trapping coyotes right now, and and I'm getting a few skunks. There's nothing I can do with them. I can't, you know, I can't turn them loose. My wife would throw me out trying to turn skunks loose. You know, I have to get rid of them, but they're a problem. And the population of skunks is expanding. I'm finding them in places that I have 5-10 years ago, there weren't any. You know, so, but that's about the only non-targets that I'm getting at all is a few skunks. And
I appreciate that. Oh, go ahead, Jim. Sorry.
As soon as it gets cold, that will end. Those skunks will hibernate, and that'll end.
Thanks for that, Jim. Thanks, Kevin. So how about we move on to some of our hands? Greg, go ahead.
Okay. Oh, so Derek, you noted that there are bobcats being released from traps if they're deemed like too small or the fur isn't high quality. What sort of traps are they being released from?
Those are foothold traps, oftentimes set in high desert country, something Jim's very familiar with, but definitely something pretty easy to release a bobcat from, especially relative to snares. Snares don't have to be a kill set, they could be a live set, but we don't really have a lot of snare use in Oregon. So yep, just foothold traps.
So they're being released potentially injured?
Sorry, what was the question?
Are they being released potentially injured?
Not that I've heard, and that's not been not something that's come back to us. If an animal does get injured, most of the time we hear the trappers, or if it's a kill set and it's not the desirable bobcat that they're looking for, they are required to keep it, and so then they add that to their card. But foothold traps are what we use for research all the time. So most of the time, especially if you're using BMP approved traps, which those are the ones that are supposed to be designed and tested to show that they're not causing damage. No, these animals are turned loose just fine, really.
Okay. Then Jim, I was wondering what damage do skunks, this is just my own ignorance, what damage do skunks cause?
What damage do they cause?
Yeah.
Well, it depends on where they are. I know in people's lawns, they get into people's lawns constantly. They dig and try to get worms is the main thing. They'll dig up their lawns trying to get worms. But I would like to address the bobcat issue you just talked about, Greg. Bobcats are very easy in a trap. When they get caught, as soon as they realize they're caught, they just lay down. They don't fight the trap. There's almost no damage at all. I've actually caught bobcats who have caught rabbits while they were in a trap. But you can release a bobcat. It's pretty rare that there's any foot damage.
Okay, thanks for that. And yeah, and I was just trying to understand why you're shooting skunks just because they're in the trap by accident. So I guess you feel that you want fewer skunks. I mean, they're like bad actors.
If I do anything else with them, I'll get sprayed.
Okay,
I can't release them without getting sprayed.
okay, thank you.
All right, Jill, you're up next.
Okay. I have a question, but first I want to mention that skunks are they do dig, and they're very good at digging up yellow jacket nests in the ground. And it's been very beneficial to us in our vineyard because we often find the yellow jacket nest by stepping on them, but they do dig up things that you really don't want to find. My question is, I think to Kevin, is first, how many traps would a wildlife services person set in an area if they're trying to catch one or more coyotes, given that they tend to be wary?
That's a really good question. If you want, I'm not going to speak for other states and even just wildlife service as a whole. That's a really dependent question upon the employee. I can go through examples of when I was trapping and protecting livestock. And in my experience, different than, at that time, certainly different than where a lot of our employees are at. I was new in our field work when I was doing that work. And our employees each have a varied skill set. And so it's really going to dictate on the circumstance, the site, the type of area where they're setting. Again, setting a trap is every piece of equipment you put out there is something that you have to check and monitor. And so you're usually trying to put as few pieces in there at that site, at that location. If you're trying to capture a coyote or a pair that are killing livestock, because of that phobia, you don't want to just, put traps out everywhere in every nook and cranny, because that's not going to help your circumstance. And again, that creates more workload. So you're trying to be as efficient as you can by utilizing this least amount of equipment possible to accomplish the task. You're also looking at then other tools and other methods. If they can call a coyote in, and if you have a territorial coyote, and if you can call that in, that is going to alleviate your problem. You've targeted the one there that's aggressive and dominant, and now you don't have to set a trap and come back to it. So there's other methods and tools that we look to in addition to just setting traps.
So if you have a coyote that's gotten trap wary, then you might choose that method over a regular trap.
Yes. Yeah.
Shoot them. Yeah.
You're going to want to look to other options to be able to exploit some things about their behavior. And if they're avoiding your traps, then you need to look to the alternatives. You might even look to another employee coming over to use their method or style that might be just enough different than what you did to, or your scent versus theirs that they might not be readily recognizing. And that's why, again, when you're looking at a damage situation, you're looking at what alternatives are available, the whole bag of options. And it's not just to set a trap every time that there's a conflict. It's to look at what do you think is going to produce the most effective and efficient way to resolve the conflict. And so that's really going to vary, and it's so site specific.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Jill. Kelly?
Hi. Oh, great. Sorry, I was also putting something into the chat. I wanted to ask, let's see, Derek, I had several comments or questions. You had mentioned, you highlighted the comparison and trap check times for just bobcats, which is one, just one animal. And I'd be interested to see the comparison for other wild animals that are trapped in comparison to other states, because bobcats, were 48 hours, and I appreciated that, but I would be interested if we were going to do something like that. I just want to say, just pulling out bobcats doesn't really give the overall picture of the other wild animals that are trapped and what that trap check time is in comparison to other states. So I wondered if a follow-up would be if we could get that comparison, like for coyotes even. And the other piece is just that we're talking a lot about non-target and target. And I think for the humane side of the US, and I think others on this particular work group, it is not just the non-target, it is the target animals that are in the trap. And even if a fur bearer is released within unharmed with injuries, I find that hard to believe that there would not be an injury after 48 hours. But that aside, that's still 48 hours where there's no protection from the elements, from predation, there's no food and water. So I never want to lose track of the fact we're having these conversations, but that we're talking about a length of a time where an animal is out there in that trap, whether it's a target or a non-target animal. So I just wanted to make that statement. And the very last point is, I so appreciate, Derek, you went through and looked at like the wildlife values with traditionalists and the others. And I even noticed in some of the states that lean more in the traditionalist column, they have even daily trap check times. So I thought that was interesting as well. So those were my comments. And one last thing I am going to put into the chat through HSUS's Wild Neighbors book that we give out to wildlife rehabbers. And we train law enforcement around the country how to humanely handle conflict or issues with skunks. So I'm going to put that in the chat. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Kelly. I'm not seeing any other hands up. There were a couple questions that I had identified just to explore a little bit further with our speakers. So one is, I noticed that on some you've got, for some states they say 24 hours and for some states they say daily. Can one of you, can either Kevin or Derek, can you talk about, what's the difference? Isn't it daily 24 hours, and why do they do one or the other?
I can chime in at first. In going through and comparing and compiling the information from other states, that's a snapshot in time. We haven't been able to take obviously any comparison or evaluation rather into what led to the decisions that they did, and why some states chose to cause a distinction. But if you look at the difference, daily is daily. So if I set a trap this morning at 8 o'clock, 24 hours would mean that I would have to check that trap by 8 o'clock tomorrow. A daily means that if I can't get to that trap by 8 o'clock, I could still get there at 10 or 2 and have it checked within a day time frame. So it allows a little bit of flexibility. Speaking to that point, if I can sidetrack a little bit, and talking to the other states and trying to get to the point of addressing damage conflicts being different, speaking on behalf of Wildlife Services, for every day when we're addressing conflicts, employees that we have in the field respond to a whole variety, and that might be a livestock situation. It could be an issue with safety for human safety at an airport. It could be an orchard, a vineyard. It could be a range of species and a range of circumstances. And anytime that we get a phone call saying this is an urgent need, and it could be sometimes law enforcement contacting us, or it could be that we have a cougar that just killed a deer on someone's back porch this morning. And so some of those things obviously then take a precedence. And so when we look at prioritizing the day for the activities, we need to respond to those things that are the most pressing. And so that having something that grants a little bit of latitude and not say, well, I've got to be to that trap set by 8 o'clock means I can't address this other life-saving in occasion or even other priority circumstance. So I think the important distinction those states recognize that 24 hours was going to be very binding and constricting on someone addressing conflict, whether it's a private individual or an agency addressing conflicts, that has to allow for a lot of pressing demands when you're trying to provide so much service to so many people. So that distinction is additional latitude. Is still within a day, but it could be more hours than 24 hours. Did that answer the question, Jamie?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And part of the question is more, it's for the viewing if we're talking about 24 hours versus daily, it's important that we understand what we're talking about. The other question I had that is for you, Kevin, is I see on the column M that several places you've got exempt. And so does that mean that you're exempt from the state rule? And so you have another set of rules you work under, or can you just talk about what that means?
So a lot of states are different, in the regulatory guidelines. And you have a lot of rules that are overseen, managed, governed by the wildlife entity, the wildlife portion of the state. And then they have an agricultural portion or a livestock specific portion. And so much of the fur bearer regulations in those states fall under the game regulations or the game portion. And then conflicts related to damage in particular to livestock fall under a different board. And in those states, they have fur regulations. And so they're exempt from those fur regulations because the authorities fall under the regulatory board, like the agricultural or livestock board that oversees those authorities to manage conflicts or damage. And so they're exempt from those. In some cases, they're exempt. There's not an established time frame that is implemented. But getting to why I tried to front load so much information early on with the portion that I presented is to recognize that just because it's exempt doesn't mean that Wildlife Services doesn't have to check traps. We still have our obligations under our ESA, under our NEPA, under our directives, including humane standards, to be able to monitor traps and to make sure and try and ensure that we are doing so in a manner that is humane. And so again, we use a lot of that on-site determination and experience with, okay, this coyote is a challenging coyote. He's avoided me in the past. I'm going to let this trap go more than that 24, more than that 48, so that I can capture that coyote to address the conflict. Versus other times when you're very confident that, yeah, I could come back, I could set this trap for some species this morning, and I'm going to come back after lunch and be able to likely have an animal in the trap. So that site-specific understanding of the circumstance, the species, and the environment to be adaptive. So in those cases, they're exempt from those fur bearer regulations, but they're not exempt from having anything or any responsibility for trap checks. And then again, varies by state.
Thanks for that, Kevin. I have one other question, but we'll go to Kyle since he's got his hand up. Go ahead, Kyle.
Maybe this is quick. I hope it's quick. It just occurred to me, Kevin, as you were talking about the different efficiency and effort. In addition to these comparisons of the time checks, do you have a sense of how the size of the Wildlife Services organization changes state to state based on these time checks? Are those two things correlated?
Good question, Kyle. I did not get specific numbers, but as I talked to a lot of these other states, I kind of tried to just get generalizations about their program. Been with Wildlife Services, 20 plus years. So, I mean, I have a base knowledge, but when you're absorbed in the moment here, you kind of forget what goes on elsewhere. But so in asking them, trying to get a scale, some of the states are small. They might have a dozen employees. You talk about Texas, over 100 employees. And so you have quite the range. And I would you have to look at and I would say more so looking at the programs or the states that have a large livestock industry or agricultural industry, because some of those are heavily dominated with bird crop damage. And so I think Wildlife Services in every state addresses human health and safety, addresses property damage, and likely in most states address some level of support to help teeny species protection. And all those are going to vary from state to state. And I think most states do some level of livestock. So if you look at the states where there's a larger livestock component, that's where you're going to see more of the need for trapping predators, and that's predominantly going to be coyotes. Other species, bears and cougars, occasionally bobcats, but generally it's going to be coyotes, cougars, or bears that prey upon livestock. So if you look to those states that have a larger agricultural base, they were probably going to have 20 to 30 to 40 field employees, probably somewhat comparable. You're going to see that it's an important aspect of that program in that state based upon the level and the types of requests that come in. But some of those states as a comparison, whether you want to look at a Montana or where you look at a Wyoming, Colorado, a Utah, they have a lot of livestock in those states, of Texas, Oklahoma. They also have other methods or an ability to utilize other methods in addition to a foothold trap. That gives them a lot more flexibility in addressing those conflicts. So even for some of those states that might have a shorter check interval for traps, have other tools and methods, whether that's pesticides, whether it's aviation, that they utilize more heavily so that they don't have to have that codependence on a trap to resolve all those conflicts. And a lot of that is based upon, again, the request and the funding mechanism associated with the request for services. What tools are they able to provide to those producers, to those industries, to those businesses, based upon the resources that come in? Kyle, that was a lot of information. Did I hit it at all in the ballpark?
Yeah, I think so. So far my takeaway is that it just highly variable, right? Every state is its own critter, for lack of a better word on top of my head right now.
Yep, I would sum it up that way.
And thanks for asking that question, Kyle. That was one on my list that came up at our last meeting was, what are the resources that different states have that are different from Oregon in terms of their ability to be successful with a shorter trap check time? More staff, more options, those kinds of things. Kelly, go ahead.
Yeah, just two quick points. I wanted to say that it does seem for California and Colorado, I think those, and maybe Washington, those were the ballot measure states where there are 24-hour trap check times. I know Washington I know Washington and Colorado for sure. I do feel oftentimes it's referenced that it was a ballot measure. And I want to then put a marker in that because it does demonstrate that when the public does have an opportunity to speak on this issue, that there are strong trap check times because this is an area of concern for the public. And is also consistent with, and I think this was referenced as well by the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. There was a study or there's some reference, I think Derek referenced that earlier, their own education manual, and it was something that was sent out in some of the materials. It's very clear, their recommendation in the education manual for all trappers is to make a commitment to check your traps at least once every day. And there's a long paragraph about it, and I won't read it, but there's very specific times, meaning even that whether it shouldn't be a factor in not checking your trap daily. And so I wanted just to put that out there again. We're talking a lot about the reasons why traps can't be checked. Maybe there's a difficult coyote, but I have to believe that there's a reason for this in place and for other states to still be in compliance and following in large part, 24-hour trap check times for coyotes, even the difficult ones to catch. Thank you for that opportunity to speak there.
Thanks for that, Kelly. Another question I had for Kevin. Kevin, you mentioned about NEPA, and I'm just wondering, how does NEPA relate to APHIS's ability to, to modify how you work to accommodate different trap check times? Does that come into play, or are you just bound to follow the lead of the states? Can you just talk about that a little bit?
Thanks for the question. And so I can provide clarification. Our Wildlife Services Directive states that we're going to abide by those state laws and locals unless there's an exemption granted. So that's a driving factor for us following those state laws. our NEPA process is a decision-making tool and allows us to be to look at all the potential reasonable alternatives that we consider. Alternative 1, 2, 3, or 4. What methods might be included in different alternatives based upon then what are potential effects, environmental effects and considerations, effects to target species, their populations, to non-targets, to T&Es, to human resources. So we can take and look at the comparison between alternatives that may incorporate different methods or different species and methods, different types of actions or locations. So we can look at those based upon what we think is a reasonable realm or a number of those and go through a comparative process to help make that decision. It involves a lot of dialogue and cooperation and feedback from agencies. We reach out to agencies and we reach out to tribes and compile information there first. And then we reach out to the public, where then everyone has an opportunity then to evaluate everything that we've considered and to draw on feedback, questions, and respond to those questions. So it gets to looking at effects. And, I don't know that we get into, but we do analyze and look at humaneness as part of one of those, because it is a concern of the public. It certainly has been raised in questions, whether that is from the public or entities or agencies. And so it's part of our dialogue and our discussion, and why we take the time to address it in NEPA and refer to what Wildlife Services does in our decision model, what we include as standard operating procedures. And so we kind of go through what I would call a lengthy process to that thought process of that we're incorporating into that site-specific analysis, that we're not making blind decisions and ignoring, environmental risks, human risks, or even human perceptions, that we're taking those things into account.
So if I can follow up, so in a state like Idaho, where you're exempt from the state wildlife rules, and there's a 72-hour, for both. So do you have to go through NEPA to set the rules for how you function in Idaho then, or do you, how does that work?
So in looking at the example of Idaho has agreements. So they have livestock boards, predator boards, I'm not sure exactly which they call them, that they interact with in the state. And through agreements with them, they've established, a minimum check timeframe. So they're exempt from the fur regulations, but through an agreement and a collaborative process of discussing that, they have a minimum check that is set. In a similar fashion, Wildlife Services in our agreement with ODFW, through our agreement with them, we've established check times, pertinent to wolves or pertinent to bears and cougars. And so through states, they can then have additional agreements or collaborations with those entities to work out an SOP, standard operating procedure, or protocols that they're going to follow.
Thanks for that. Jill, your hands up.
Yeah. So it's interesting discussion on NEPA. So is NEPA, I know you've explained a lot, but I'm still a little confused because NEPA was for the federal agencies I've worked with, was always on federal lands. And my understanding is Wildlife Services doesn't work on federal lands, at least not in Oregon. And so what is this like? Are you like setting a broad, sort of like doing a habitat conservation plan through NEPA in an area or the whole state, or I guess, and is it private land, state land, federal land that this takes place on?
Good question, Jill, and I appreciate the follow-up for clarity. All federal agencies, and I'll just kind of sum and say that are a lead agency, if they're the lead federal agency or any federal agency involved in an action, has to have some type of NEPA analysis, consideration for NEPA. And each agency will have their CEQ regs related to NEPA. that defines those environmental regulations. And then agencies and departments will have implementation regs, how their agency will implement them. Short gist is Wildlife Services does NEPA for the actions that we do, that we take the lead responsibility for. And so we do NEPA regardless of whether it's going to be private land or whether it's going to be some form of public land. And yes, we do work on federal lands, very limited, but we do work on federal lands through agreement and MOU with both Forest Service and BLM, primarily when there's livestock conflict on those lands. But it's a very small fraction of the work we do, and is even a smaller fraction of the amount of take that we have here in Oregon. So we take the responsibility to engage in the NEPA process for our actions here. Let me pause. Does that help clarify what role Wildlife Services takes with NEPA, Jill?
Yeah, that does. But that brought up another question was.
I'm sure it does.
Yeah, especially with the I believe I heard Derek say that that there is no predator, I guess, predator that landowners cannot claim that there's predators taking their cattle if they're on federal land when they have a permit to run their cattle on a portion of federal land. So that what you just said, it sounded like those landowners may, or cattle owners, whatever they are, may bring in Wildlife Services to deal with something that's happening on their livestock when they have a permit to graze on federal land. So I'm kind of confused, and I'm not sure if Daryl can help clarify that too.
Derek, chime in if you feel to, but
Derek.
Predatory animals defined by statute refer to select species, coyotes and some rodents when on private land. When on public land, some of those same species, like a beaver, it becomes a fur-bearing mammal. Coyotes, if not on private land, are an unprotected mammal. Unprotected mammals discussed early on fall on the 48-hour perspective. Derek, make sure I'm quoting that right? So while on public lands, on Forest Service, on a grazing allotment, if a landowner, not a landowner, but a livestock producer is having conflicts on grazing allotment, they can contact us under our national MOU and under discussion with the Forest Service or BLM. We can work to see if there's things that we can do to help that livestock producer on that grazing allotment. But it goes with a lot more discussion and planning and looking at minimization of our exposure to public and avoiding times of years where it's more likely to have, we're avoiding hunting seasons. And so there's a lot more work, and that's why it's such a small amount of the work that Oregon does. It's just because we've drawn back and made a lot more limitations on when we can provide those services. And also it correlates to when those animals are on those allotments.
And you follow the fur bearer then rules in that case.
Just to clarify, unprotected coyotes are unprotected mammals. It's the same 48 hours, but they're an unprotected mammal. They're not a fur bearer, but it's the same time frame.
Right. Okay, thanks.
So we're at the bottom of the hour here at 3:30. When I said we wanted to end this conversation with Derek and with Kevin. And so, are there any other reflections or observations that you have for Derek and Kevin or for the group before we sort of take a step back and look at the information that we've heard to date and identify additional information needs and kind of what our next steps are moving forward as a group? Because I did see that one follow-up I saw from Greg, and Kelly asked about this as well, is taking a closer look at other examples in addition to bobcats, particularly predators such as coyotes, bear, and cougars. Greg put that in the chat. So that's one follow-up from this. Kevin, did you have something to add about that?
I was just going to mention briefly on that subject, when you start looking at other species, I wanted a question for Derek on what other information is available based upon the survey that the states provide. So Derek can respond to that later. But when you look at coyotes in a lot of the states, one of the questions that was, I think Kelly had articulated and tried to dissect through a lot of the state laws, different states recognize different groups of animals by different regulations, much like we have a predatory animal statute, and then we have fur bearers, we have unprotected mammals. Not every state recognizes each individual species in the same way. And so when you look at coyotes in particular across multiple states, you're going to find a lot of different distinctions of whether they're a fur bearer or they're unprotected, whether they're not considered a protected species. So depending on what species you want to look at, this might introduce, again, more layers to that topic.
And I can add to the question of Kevin posed of what information is available. And yeah, we today presented, we tried to group states by their number one focal species. When trappers are being surveyed, they had the opportunity to identify their top 4 species that they basically pursue or arguably get the license for in the first place. So that data is readily available. We could just add in the second most comparable, or their second and the third. That's readily available. That's on the AWFO report. But again, we're only using that to try to identify similar states. So states where raccoons are the number one species that trappers pursue, that doesn't have that great of alignment with Oregon. And then all of the regulations that come with raccoon trappers, and that being their targeted species, is different than bobcat trappers. And that's where the vast majority of Oregon trappers are pursuing that particular species. So we could continue to add those other secondary and tertiary focal species, which could change some of those states that we bring into the consideration or in that table. Chances are it's just probably just going to, put some X's next to some states that don't have X's right now. But I bet there's going to be a lot of overlap, especially too, if you look at, I think coyote is the number 2 species in Oregon. Yeah, by far. But that's the case for nearly, that's a good chunk of the West as well. So we're probably just going to get more of the same. But we absolutely can entertain that because the data is already there. As far as coming up with, because again, we're trying to look at what states to compare to, getting into details of what a trap check time for a particular species isn't what we were trying to do today. It was try to identify those states that have kind of a similar constituency, or the people that are on the ground are going to be very similar in their activities, and therefore the regulations may be comparable.
Thanks for that clarification,
Yeah, I
Derek.
brought the other,
Go ahead, Greg.
other species up because, there's species that, as we know, we address a lot in the commission, not coyotes, but bear and cougars. There's species that people have a lot of concerns about. And so that's why I brought those up.
So it sounds like that Derek and his team can go back and add that information in so we can have a more comprehensive look. And so that's one follow-up. So why don't let's go ahead and take a look at the work plan table and think about other information that would be helpful at this point. Kind of look at the information that we've shared and where we're going with the number of meetings that we have left, and the information that people have asked for. Because at some point we need to start making sense of the information that we've all heard and see what that means in terms of recommendations. And so I introduced this earlier in the day. You know, we had meetings on the charter mission scope, on current background on trapping regulations today, information about APHIS's wildlife services and OSP, so we could understand again current practices and what they're seeing out there, opportunities or concerns. We focused in on best management practices and trap check technology. Heard more information about animal welfare and ethics. Today we did the comparison across states, and we've got a follow-up around that. Two other topics that have come up are around kind of taking a deeper dive around injuries related to and trauma to wildlife, and what that might mean to inform trap check times. And the other piece is around economics. Greg has shared that in the past. I was looking back at some notes from a previous meeting about some questions that were raised about economics. Let's see, so that's oh, I didn't bookmark it in my notes here. So those are two other substantive topics. We brought up the question of economics to Derek when we met with ODFW staff last week. And Derek, you had said that you had presented to the commission at some point in the past about the economics related to trapping. So, you know, the cost to the state, you know, just all of those numbers. And so one thought we had was, we wondered if we could share that presentation with this group and have that be homework, and then have us have a conversation about that presentation. But I wasn't sure if the presentation covered enough of the questions that Greg had brought up or others. So Greg, what were some of the questions, the information that you had said that you would like to hear about economics?
I think Derek, what you provided before was the cost to implement the program, the pelt values, which change. Yeah, they go up and down with different species. The revenue to the department for permits, the revenue to trappers. You know, those sorts of questions. I don't recall if you covered all of those, but I think you addressed a number of them. You have some tables and so on to share. Is that right?
Yeah, if I remember right, Greg, at your request, we went into a bit of a dive on the costs of the program, implementing the program, staff time. We got a bunch of admins involved of going through that exercise, and then also just the revenue from the license sales. We present every time we do the commission regulation packet. We present numbers on average pelt prices, but we really don't. We could just kind of stop there, because in many cases it's just it's an indication of where licenses may go and some interest in the activity. But otherwise, we've never taken a really deep dive. OFWA has a little bit through their survey. They've found out what the expenditures of the trappers are and then what they're getting from their furs. But yeah, we don't go that far. We do provide that content to our economists when they're trying to, you know, do their due diligence for the rulemaking process to look at potential economic impacts. But yeah, we've never really gotten too deep into, you know, is this a profitable activity for trappers? Usually it's not. It's more of just you know, an activity that they enjoy. If they're lucky, they can maybe get their gas money covered. But for the program itself in the agency, it's relatively small, but it is indeed at least viable regarding the current or the latest input from licenses and cards being sold.
Okay, yeah, that would be helpful. I know you have that at hand, and so it wouldn't have to take up that much time.
Yeah, and Jamie, maybe what we could do is I could send you and Sam the YouTube link to that part of the presentation, because it's all recorded, and then maybe double check your notes that you're taking now to see if what we covered in that past presentation is adequate to cover these topics that are of interest to the group right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good idea. So you share it with us. We'll take a look at it, and then we'll follow up with you about the items that it looks like might be missing. I did find my notes from a previous conversation, and it was let's see, the economics have to do with the damage economics of changing trap check times, loss of crops, etc., damage economic impacts, and then the ODFW program management cost benefit for the agency. So that's some of what was included there. So, and I don't know on the damage side, I don't know if that's like a Kyle question and a Farm Bureau question. I'm just not sure where we go for that. So Kyle, maybe we could follow up with you.
Yeah, I was thinking that same thing. We could, in terms of the impact from damage, I've got that for some of our stuff, mostly ungulate browse, but we're starting to put together some numbers around boomer damage, which might be helpful. And then it'd be interesting to see what Marianne and Lauren have for their outfit.
Yeah, because I know that from AOC side, when Lauren was there, she had said that they had some numbers county by county around damage, like county roadsides of things. But anyway, so there's a little bit more work to do around the economics of that. And then the other conversation that people were interested in is a deeper dive around injuries and trauma, and hearing from veterinarian experts. And so I wanted to hear from the group about how we would go about populating that presentation. And so we heard from ODFW that, Dr. Colin Gilliam, they are a veterinarian for ODFW, but we wondered, because we talked with Kelly about this quite a bit and with Bob Salinger a little bit as well, about another veterinarian perspective from like a rehab perspective. And so those were a couple of the ideas we had there. So any thoughts people have around how we go about populating that presentation? So those are the two substantive pieces that are still outlying. And then so it makes sense, we could do both of those at the meeting on the 16th if people do a homework piece in advance around the economics. If we do two presentations, one the 16th and one the 7th, that really starts to cut down on our ability to start focusing on recommendations. And just an aside, what we're doing with the Beaver group tomorrow, they're having a 3-hour meeting. And part of that meeting is going to be working in small groups to begin to brainstorm potential management options that people want to put forward, so that we can start to hone in on what that suite of recommendations might look like. So, so I'd like to do a similar thing with this group, is start moving us probably, at the December meeting, if not earlier, into starting to think about, okay, what are given everything we've learned, what are the recommendations that this group wants to put on the table for us to start discussing pros and cons around. So I'm going to pause there. I see Tyler's hand up. Tyler?
Yeah, Jamie, can I jump in?
Sure.
Okay, yeah, I think if we're going to look at a economist perspective, I think cost to resource owners should absolutely be included. But I also wanted to talk about another topic that I think needs to be integrated into our remaining meetings here, and I was hoping to couple it with the veterinarian experts discussion. I think that trap check interval conversations are going to be incessant, and I think we can all agree they're not going away. So I think that, and I'm the only one that's said this so far, I think in the work group, but research pre-proposal, I think, needs to be on the table for consideration for a possible recommendation from this work group. I think it'd be prudent to establish a foundation that we can all stand on. And obviously that foundation that I keep preaching is empirical data as it pertains to animal welfare. So to me, this is a really important topic. And I just said this, but the interest in this trap check interval conversation is not going to diminish. So I think that animal welfare, in response to trapping, is worthy of discussion of a robust study. And it's worthy of some time to empirically describe animals' health and body condition. And I don't think it is going to be impossible. I think that this group needs to start talking about that as a possible recommendation from this work group. I mean, I'm coming out of a study right now. I know studies are not cheap. They take a while, but in the future, we're going to have this conversation again. I can guarantee it. And I think it would be very helpful to know some empirical data pertaining to animal welfare moving forward. And groups that don't agree with this, I would ask why that foundation is not necessary. So we're not just having a discussion back and forth, your word versus mine. Why don't we actually get some data?
Tyler, I don't know if you meant to inadvertently mute yourself, but
No, I didn't. I didn't touch the mute button. I must have been talking too long.
Yeah.
Where did I leave off there?
you were just talking about you were underscoring again the need for empirical data around animal trauma to help inform trap check times.
Yeah, just and stop me if I've already said this and was muted or not. But I think animal welfare in response to trapping is worthy of a study, and I think it's worthy of some time for us to sit on a rock hard foundation that is data. So it's not just your word versus mine. And I think that moving into the future, we're going to have these conversations again, and I think that's clear. I don't think that every group is going to be satisfied with how this work group comes to a close. So to me, it makes sense that we start talking science.
All right, thanks for that. We've got two hands up, Greg and then Quinn.
Yeah, I agree with Tyler 100%. And I think some of the science that is known is animal physiology. And what we have in common as animals, as mammals, what humans have in common with other mammals in terms of our nervous system and response to pain. And so there's a lot of documentation around that. So I agree with Tyler, but I also feel that there's quite a bit right now that can be brought up and talked about. And we can obviously propose some sort of study out into the future.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah, of course. And then
Okay.
then we'll have Quinn. Go ahead, Tyler.
Yeah, and I just think it would be great to have data directly from trapping, right? As a result of trapping, I just think it would be quite informative to know what a 24-hour trap check does to an animal as opposed to a 48-hour trap check and so on. A more directed study, I think, would help inform these conversations into the next decades. And I don't think that should be excluded from our conversations here. I know it's a big undertaking, and I don't take that lightly. But I'm thinking about this in defense of the trapping practice. We want to know. We're not trying to evade the subject of animal welfare. We'd like to know as well, and we'd like to be able to stand on firm ground moving forward.
I hear you, Tyler. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Tyler and Greg. Quinn.
Thank you. No, I appreciate everything that Tyler said, and I agree. I think there's room for us to increase our understanding of this issue, and that it's also likely not going away. I think one piece of data that as should we head down that road that we really need is also public perception. I mean, I think we all understand that a big piece of the puzzle here is what the public thinks of these issues. I mean, that's what's driven most of these conversations across the country. So to the extent that we're gathering empirical data, I think that's part of it, right? Is polling to understand what Oregonians think. And I think any study would be incomplete without that component.
Can I respond to that also? Sorry for jumping in. I haven't talked all day. I'm just trying to take my time here, but
It's good. I mean, we want to have a conversation, so.
Right.
Go ahead,
I really appreciate that aspect too. And I also think a study like this would help inform the public, and maybe trapping wouldn't have such a PR problem if we knew what it's doing to animals, right? What a 24 versus a 48-hour trap check is doing to animals. And I think that, from OHA's perspective, informing the public is a big aspect of why we may be asking for a study like this, is that maybe it would change some minds of the public. Maybe it wouldn't. I don't know what the data are going to say, but it'd be really nice to know.
Yeah, and I think, including the 76 hours and 7 days and 30 days, which fall under the on a regular basis for predators. I think that would also be useful in an empirical study.
And I don't disagree with that at all.
Jill?
I have no problem with a study and expanding it the way it's been recommended. Are you proposing, Tyler, that we pretty much stop this process of making recommendations to the commission other than a study, and therefore stop any changes, potential changes that might happen to, I don't see it happening to the fur bearer aspect, since that's in statute, but to the predatory trapping.
I think you're asking me, is a study OHA's only supported outcome of the work group? Is that what you're asking me?
I'm asking you if you're asking that we basically stop what we're doing and possibly making recommendations to the commission other than a study, which you're proposing.
No, but I think the study needs to be a part of our recommendation. I mean, I will say this work group seems like a broken record in terms of people's opinions, right? It's just like we keep going back and forth, saying the same things. We bring in experts and it doesn't seem to change the minds of one side of the table versus the other. I'm not saying we need to stop in our tracks here and just say we need to learn more, but I can say that that's, at this point, that's the only outcome that OHA would support. It seems from the discussion we've had. OHA simply wants these data to be discovered and doesn't like to make decisions based on emotion. So that's where we stand at this point.
Okay, thanks for clarifying.
So we've got just a few minutes left in our meeting. We've identified potentially 2 substantive topics to talk about. It seems like if we were to engage, take a deeper dive in the injuries and trauma to wildlife discussion with veterinarian experts, that could really help to inform, the parameters of a study or the questions that we would need to be asked, because we could engage with conversation with veterinary experts about, what is out there now, and what would they recommend, and how, just their thoughts on that. So it seems like that would be a really useful discussion to have to help inform some of the parameters of that study. Tyler and Jill?
Yeah, and I just wanted to throw out an idea. I know we're sitting on an elevated platform here as part of this work group, and wondering if one of the co-authors or 2 of the co-authors from these BMPs that we've been reading might be willing to help us with a pre-proposal for a project. I think that they have teed up nicely a project for Oregon to conduct, and I think that might be useful.
Jill, and then I'll see what other people's thinking is around Tyler's suggestion. Jill?
Okay, well, mine wasn't along those lines at all, but the veterinary discussion, OSU has a veterinary school. And if we want somebody who's not involved in either side of this discussion, we might ask them if they have any expertise in this area.
So somebody more neutral.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is there a name that comes to mind, or should Sam and I just explore that with OSU, and also what other people think?
I don't have a name. I get their email occasionally where they always are talking about domesticated animals from what I've seen, but I don't know if they've been involved in any rehabbing or or anything else along those lines. So if you could investigate, I guess, might be the next option.
Thanks for that, Jill. Kelly, Susan, Quinn, are you aware of, I mean, just do you tend to be on the rehab side?
I
of
think
folks at
that,
OSU?
yeah, I was thinking, I think the director of the Oregon Veterinary Medical Association works there closely with the OSU veterinary program. They work, I think Glenn Kolb is the director of OVMA. He might be a good resource for a vet affiliated with OVMA or the Oregon State University veterinary program. And that seems neutral.
Yeah, thanks for that, Kelly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just an independent exotic animal veterinarian. And I know some names could come up, and I mean, there's one that I have takes care of my pet skink. Okay, and I think what I learned was that person that runs that office was also involved with what I call the skunk lobby. So they may have a bias, but I think they were involved with all the skunk owners when we were going through the AZA enclosure discussions. So I don't know, they may not be, they may be deemed or perceived to be biased, but I know of an independent animal veterinarian that's in Southwest Portland. So anyway, we could put some names together.
Okay, so we've got a few leads there, and then on the economic side, we've got to follow up with Derek on what he's already put together and where there might be some gaps. So I think that really does flesh out at the very least the November 16th meeting, and maybe a part of the December 7th meeting. And so you can expect a scheduling poll from Sam about looking at scheduling 2 dates in January, and we probably will go ahead and just do a kind of an extra meeting in February in case we need it to put together a presentation and those kinds of things. And then you can see we've got 1, 2, 3, basically 3 to 4 meetings focused on recommendations. And so I appreciate, Tyler, you bringing up your idea. And so I think we really should start kind of coming forward with the group to start thinking about, what are the ideas and recommendations you'd put on the table. And at the December 7th meeting and moving forward from there, we'll really be focusing on that. So that's, we're right up at 4 o'clock. There's a couple things in the chat. Let me read it out for our public here. Quinn needed to leave. Greg suggests that the economists from the Beaver Group may be interested in looking at trapping economics. We already talked about the other animals. Kyle put in, I'm not sure if Ernie would be the best resource for a trapping related economics assessment. This focus tends to be on negative impacts from active land management. That's the Beaver economist. That's everything in the chat for our viewing public. So with that, it's very full meeting today, lots of things to take away. Of course, any follow-up anybody has individually with us, be sure to email us. Our next meeting is November 16th. Sam and I have got our work cut out for us in terms of putting together the folks and information for those presentations. And I think that's it for today. So appreciate everybody's time and attention, and we'll be signing off. Thanks,
everybody.
viewing public.
So